Okay, so this video is about ATP and let's get started. So ATP is the energy currency for the cell. When we say that cells need energy, ATP is what they're going to use. Now, you may have learned that in maybe like a carbohydrates unit that carbs or sugars give us energy. Well, things like glucose, molecules like glucose, are very large. And so they're not a usable form of energy by the cell. It's more like potential energy. So during the process of cellular respiration, in our cytoplasm and in our mitochondria, we break these organic molecules down, and in the process, we produce ATP. So how is a totally different topic in video, but basically, we're making usable energy in the form of ATP when we do cellular respiration. So ATP is small and easily used by cells. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about ATP. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So our molecule is made of a 5-carbon sugar called ribose, a nitrogen base, adenine, which is the same nitrogen base you find in RNA and DNA. And then we have 3 phosphate groups. Now, these phosphates are all negatively charged, and if you've learned in chemistry or physical science, negative and negative would repel each other. So you're like forcing 3 negatively charged molecules together. It's kind of like a compressed spring, forcing them together and bonding them. So that is our structure, adenosine triphosphate. Tri means 3. So when we look at this, how is this an energy molecule, right? Like, how does this store or release energy? Well, the energy is stored between the 2nd and the 3rd phosphate groups in that bond. Now, this is like a fully charged battery. Now, when we hydrolyze means to add water to break bonds. So when ATP is hydrolyzed, we break off that 3rd phosphate and the energy is released, or that's where the energy comes from for powering different functions within the cell. So when ATP is hydrolyzed, energy is released, and we're left with ADP and an inorganic phosphate. That little I stands for inorganic, meaning that it is not attached to anything. It's like free floating. Now, ADP has less stored energy compared to ATP. So if I play this slide over again, let's just point a few things out. Actually, so here we have ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It has stored potential energy. Now, technically this little I shouldn't show up yet until it breaks off, but okay. So when we hydrolyze, or when we break off that 3rd phosphate, that is the source of energy to power cellular functions. Now, we say that this ATP is hydrolyzed, and what we're left with is ADP with 2 phosphates and an inorganic phosphate. This has less potential energy, or less stored energy when compared to ATP. Okay, so now let's talk about this. So ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate, and it has 2 phosphate groups. So when we think about, like, how is this different from ATP? Well, it has 2 phosphates and less energy stored because there's only now like 1 bond between the 1st and 2nd phosphate group. But that's really all that's different. So now let's go ahead and continue. So here we have what's called the ATP ADP cycle. So ATP is a high energy molecule. And when we break off, or we hydrolyze that 3rd phosphate group, we are left with ADP and an inorganic phosphate, a single phosphate. So this is happens when energy is required or used in cellular things like active transport or muscle contraction. Now, though, to replace or replenish the ATP, we can take ADP and a phosphate and attach them. So we can join them together, and that is now recycling or rebuilding ATP, and we're back to the high energy adenosine triphosphate. So this cycle, so in our cells, like millions of times per second in our active cells, so if you're riding a bike or running, in a muscle cell, you have ATP breaking and releasing energy and being reformed millions of times. So it's a very common process that's constantly happening within our cells. Okay, so now though, let's connect this to cellular respiration and glucose. So if sugar gives us energy, how does that actually happen? Like, that's our big question moving into our next unit. So glucose, we eat, and we have this stored energy in this glucose molecule. It's traveling through our bloodstream, providing energy for our cells, but it's not usable energy. So we convert glucose into ATP, but not directly. Like, we're not taking the C, H, and O from glucose, but rather in chemical reactions, we're going to break apart glucose. And as we break it apart, the different pieces will be used in the production of ATP. And so that's a whole nother topic though. But we're going to use the mitochondria for these reactions. So there's 3 steps basically. The first one occurs in the cytoplasm and is called glycolysis. Glycolysis is going to start with our sugar, our glucose, and actually we'll break it in half. But in glycolysis, we only make 2 ATP. Then our next step in aerobic respiration is the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle, likewise, only makes 2 ATP. However, the third and final step is the electron transport chain, or oxidative phosphorylation, depending on which bioclass you're taking. So in this third step, though, the final step, this is where the majority of our ATP is going to be produced. So when we say, or you learn, that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, really, when we think about this, it's because that is where the majority of our ATP is being produced in aerobic respiration. So we started with glucose, but through a series of reactions called glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, we were able to then produce a ton, well, about 32 to 36 ATP for 1 molecule of glucose. All right. So for me, my next lesson will be about these steps, glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, to see technically how we make this ATP. All right. Good job, my wonderful students.